Get started. Hey everybody. Sorry, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Just waiting on it to be 1 o'clock. Welcome to those of you who are here already. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started since my clock says 1. Welcome to everybody who's joining in. Just a couple notes before we get started. This is the third webinar I've done now, and while everything seems to work fine technology-wise, you never know. So if you're having any problems hearing me or seeing the videos that I'm going to share today, please let me know. There is a little chat feature. You can throw that kind of stuff into the chat, and I have the window up so I can see it. Also, if you have any questions at all during the time of this webinar, throw it into the chat and I will try and answer it as I go or at the end. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Emily Davenport. I work for the University of Georgia in the Marine Science Department, and I am part of a group called ECOGIG. ECOGIG stands for Ecosystem Impacts of Oil and Gas Inputs to the Gulf, which is a really big mouthful. We were formed several years ago after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It's my job to tell people about what our scientists who are working in the Gulf are learning and understanding, but also just to share with anyone and everyone interesting information about the ocean. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about chemosynthesis, which is something that you may or may not have heard of before. And it's a big mouthful, but I will tell you about it. It's a very important process in the ocean. Hopefully you learn something new today. Okay, so just to start out, let's think about what your body needs for energy. Normally when I do this, I would have some of you share ideas, but I'll just go ahead and say that most people rely on food for energy. And all of our food starts with a process called photosynthesis. So we rely on sunlight to provide energy for us. Sun helps the plants grow. The plants produce a sugar that is then consumed by something that eats the plants, and then we eat the animal, or in some cases we eat the plant. So everything on Earth relies on a process called photosynthesis. At least anything that is near sunlight. How about that? So what about if we live somewhere where sunlight did not exist? What would we eat? How would we survive? That is where chemosynthesis comes in. So in the deep sea, there is no sunlight. But there are a lot of animals that live there, and the animals that live there rely on a process called chemosynthesis. So it's a similar idea to photosynthesis, except in the absence of sunlight, you have chemicals that then work to fuel a bacteria that is generating a sugar that produces food for the animals. So instead of plants and instead of sunlight, you have chemicals and bacteria. And there are a lot of chemosynthetic communities that live in the deep sea. So a lot of them occur around hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are underwater volcanoes, and they release hot water that can be up to 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and chemicals that are dissolved in the hot water. They release it into the surrounding ocean water. And as they release that hot water with chemicals in it, the chemicals precipitate out, which means they fall out of the water onto the surrounding seafloor and just kind of build up this giant vent. And they can grow to be 100 feet tall. And there are tons of animals, chemosynthetic communities that live around these hydrothermal vents, as well as other places in the ocean besides hydrothermal vents. And so a chemosynthetic community is any sort of biological community, so animals that rely on this bacteria who use chemical compounds as an energy source. And so it's known as a symbiotic relationship. So the bacteria benefit because they get a safe place to live, and then the animal gets a food source. Oftentimes the bacteria live directly inside the animal. So that's how the bacteria benefit in that case. So one of the animals that is a chemosynthetic animal are these hydrothermal vent tubeworms. And this is actually how scientists discovered the process of chemosynthesis in the first place. They were diving in the submarine Alvin in the 70s and just kind of diving around hydrothermal vents, trying to discover what a hydrothermal vent even was, and they accidentally stumbled upon these tubeworms. I'm looking, sorry, I just see questions right here. What kind of bacteria do the animals eat? There's lots of different bacteria species. One that is common and is named Veggiatoa, and but there's a bunch of other different bacteria species that I don't know all the names of right off the top of my head, but Veggiatoa is definitely a common one that you'll find near hydrothermal vents. So these tubeworms are really interesting looking. They have this really beautiful red plume. It kind of looks like a feather, or sometimes people say they look like lips. And they have this white tube that they build themselves out of a material called chitin, which is similar to like the cartilage in your nose or your ears, where it's kind of soft and squishy, but not as hard as bone, but not as soft as like fat. So somewhere in the middle. And that protects the body of the worm, which is inside this tube. So here you can see kind of what it's made up of. So it's got this beautiful red plume, the tube, and then this body part right here. And I see another question. Are most deep sea discoveries great accidents? I think that I don't know if they're necessarily accidents, although in the case of the discovery of the tubeworm, it was a little bit of an accident in that they accidentally landed on the tubeworms. But yes, I think most deep sea discoveries, we aren't necessarily going down there with the idea that this might, or that this is, that we're going to find, we're going to go down to the deep sea knowing hopefully that we're going to discover something. And maybe we know enough about bacteria that we could say, oh, that's weird or interesting. Let's learn more, and maybe we discover something. But I think most most new discoveries are sometimes an accident, I think. We're not necessarily going down there with the idea that we're going to discover something new, um, medically or whatever, that it's, whoa, whoops, look at that. That's a cool thing. Let's learn more about it. And then we learn, oh, this is a new thing. Why is the body called a cavity? That's a good question. I'm not sure. That other diagrams, they actually call this a trophosome, which is the inside of the worm. And I have a little video that I'm going to show you that will tell you more about that in a minute. Which here it is. So anyway, hopefully this will work. If not, I will give you the link to this video, which you can find on YouTube. But the last time I showed a video, this worked just fine. So here we go.
There are plenty of creatures out there in the world with only one opening to handle the business of both taking in food and getting rid of the leftovers. Jellyfish, for example, get along fine with a mouth that is also an anus. But there's at least one animal out there that doesn't have a gut opening at all. The giant tube worm Riftia pachyptilla lives over a kilometer deep in the ocean along ocean ridges where hydrothermal vents are common and spew boiling hot, chemical-laden water into the freezing cold deep sea. These chemicals include stuff like hydrogen sulfide, which isn't all that great for most animals, but these bizarre-looking worms are adapted to live in this hostile habitat without so much as a mouth to make things easier. Riftia almost looks like a lipstick with their vivid red plumes and tube-like outer casing. Within, they have a structure called a trophosome, which is like a gut, but with no way in or out. They were first discovered in 1977 when the submarine Alvin accidentally landed on a cluster of them while it was investigating hydrothermal vents near the Galapagos. Red blood gushed up around the sub. The researchers on board later discovered that the tubeworm's plume has blood vessels full of hemoglobin. In us mammals, hemoglobin is mainly responsible for transporting oxygen. In Riftia, the tubeworm's plume acts like a gill. Its hemoglobin helps pull that hydrogen sulfide from the vent water and move it into the trophosome. Inside the trophosome are millions of symbiotic bacteria, accounting for up to half of the body weight of the worm. The bacteria are able to convert the toxic vent water chemicals into a food source for the worm through a process called chemosynthesis. Much like plants use photosynthesis to produce food using sunlight, these bacteria are getting their food through chemical reactions that use hydrogen sulfide to produce energy. And the inside of a worm, it turns out, is a much better habitat for them than the open vents, or so the hypothesis goes. Not only have the bacteria turned this hostile environment into an advantage, the worms have capitalized right along with them. And they don't need a mouth or anus. They just get fed by their bacterial partners, which produce enough food to keep everyone happy. It's like having your kitchen in your body. Okay, so that's how the food gets in, but how does it get out? Well, the waste produced from digesting this food can be transported back out via the worm's bloodstream. There's no need for either a mouth or an anus. But this makes you want to ask another question. If there's no way in or out, how do those bacteria get in there? Researchers asked this question back in 2006 and found that it's weird. The bacteria enter through the tube worm's skin when it's still a larva. So basically, this is a bacterial infection. Hydrothermal vents are an unpredictable place to call home. Thanks to the constant tectonic activity happening along ocean ridges, they may be there one day and gone the next. Once the vents stop venting, the tube worms die because their bacteria's food source gets cut off. The distance between them can be several miles, which is a long swim when you're a little worm. So researchers aren't sure how tube worm larvae get from place to place without a food source. Hypotheses range from whale falls to shipwrecks, which could supply enough of the chemicals the bacteria need to stay alive. The discovery of these weird worms and their unique way of eating has led to researchers finding chemosynthetic communities and ecosystems around the world, from elsewhere in the ocean to Yellowstone National Park. Who knew a giant, mouthless, buttless worm could completely redefine the way we thought about how life works on our planet? Thank you for watching, and thank you to our patrons for helping us bring this video into the world. What world would it be without it? If you want to help out and join our amazing community of supporters, check out patreon.com/scishow.
Okay, so nope. All right, so hopefully those you learned a little bit more about tube worms, the buttless worms, as they like to call them. Anyway, tube worms are one of my favorite deep sea creatures. They are a very interesting creature. They're also, those ones that they were talking about are very large. So they can be 6 to 8 feet tall and about as big around as your arm. And they grow really fast because of the environment that they live in. They can get that big in like 1 to 2 years, which is pretty interesting. And they also, at the end of the video, mention other places where those tube worms might get some of their energy from if the hydrothermal vent goes away and maybe there's a baby tube worm larva swimming. Shipwrecks are a place where chemicals are also available. They come out of the wood. And then whale falls as well, as the whales are degrading. Sorry, and I can see you can't quite hear me, so I will speak up. And anyway, so let's move on to another chemosynthetic community. Sound is still low. I'm gonna bring my computer closer to my mouth. Sorry, guys. I've tried putting in headphones, but somehow I get a feedback when I do that. So can you hear me now? Is that better? I'm gonna keep going. Okay, sounds like it's better. All right, so another chemosynthetic community that we might find in the ocean are cold seeps. So cold seeps are places where oil and gas bubble out of the seafloor from big pools of that oil and gas underneath the seafloor. And this is why we drill for oil in the ocean, because there are big reserves of oil and gas buried beneath the seafloor, and some of it just naturally bubbles out of the seafloor. So you get these really interesting cold seep communities, and they're called cold seeps because there's no temperature difference. The temperature is the same as the deep sea water around it, whereas in a hydrothermal vent, you can see really you'll see really hot water coming out, and the rest of the deep sea is very cold. So this picture right here that I'm showing you is a cold seep community. So these are oil bubbles. Actually, it's probably a methane gas bubble coated in oil. And then this is actually asphalt that's kind of come out of the seafloor. And then these here, if you were with me on Monday, I talked about methane ice worms. These are methane ice worms. And so to give you a sense of scale, they're probably about as long as your thumb. So that's about how big this picture is. Those guys are only about 1 inch long, maybe 2 inches long. And that orange stuff that they're living on is frozen methane gas. So some of the methane, as it bubbles out of the seafloor, because the pressure is so high and the temperature is low, like the temperature of your refrigerator, the methane actually forms this spongy solid. Instead of being a gas, it becomes a solid. And there's a bacteria that grows on that methane that is using it as a food source. And then these ice worms actually graze the bacteria off of the methane gas, the frozen methane gas. Okay, and so then there's a question, how do the oil bubbles not mix with the other water? Eventually they do. Oil and water don't really mix very well, but they will bubble up. This is just a snapshot of what's happening. So they'll bubble up and we can actually see little oil slicks on the surface of the ocean, even above an oil seep or cold seep. You can actually see it on the surface of the ocean as well. It forms a little oil slick. So that's one indicator of like where a cold seep might be nearby because there's a little oil slick happening there. So this is a short video. This will kind of show you in real time what it looks like. So you can see those bubbles bubbling out, that's methane gas, and then the oil coated methane bubbles are a little slower. They're oozing out more than just bubbling out. Cold seeps you can have a really active cold seep, lots of oil and gas bubbling out, or you can have ones that are just not as active. This one looks to be a pretty active oil seep. Oops, and then, okay. So here is an up close of those methane ice worms eating the bacteria that's living on the frozen methane gas. And I have another question. Do any sea creatures eat the ice worms? I do believe that they are a food source for some creatures that live down there. I'm not 100% sure what would eat them, but anything that might eat, they're a polychaete worm, so there are lots of different polychaete worms. These ones are specific to live on methane ice. So I would imagine anything that would enjoy eating a worm like this would eat these guys, probably crabs, maybe some fish, octopus even, I'm not sure. Anything that would find a polychaete worm to be delicious would probably eat these guys. And another question, do oil seeps affect the other sea creatures nearby? So any animals that are living near an oil seep are adapted to living and surviving in that kind of environment. So that amount of oil is not necessarily a bad thing for the animals that live there. They're used to it. They aren't impacted by it. Also the oil that is bubbling out has been degraded by bacteria that live in the sea floor. So they're actually eating away at that oil and making it less toxic than the oil that gushed out of the wellhead during the Deepwater Horizon, which was freshly tapped oil. Like we tapped right into the source and it was just gushing that fresh oil that hadn't been exposed to anything for millions of years since it formed. That form of oil is much more toxic than the oil that slowly bubbles out of the seafloor that bacteria have been working to degrade and make safer for the animals around them. And then a good question, are those oil-eating bacteria used to deal with oil spills? Those oil-eating bacteria definitely are present during an oil spill, and our researchers were looking at the what's called a bloom of bacteria, so where they grow and they make a massive amount of bacteria naturally after the oil spill. They were looking to see if those bacteria bloomed, if they grew really fast and ate the oil that was spilled. And they did find that there was a bacterial bloom. They also found that if you know that we applied a dispersant to the oil that was spilled to try and break it up into smaller droplets, they found that those oil-eating bacteria actually work to degrade the dispersant as well. So they thought that was a delicious food source. So that was kind of a downside, was that they degraded the dispersant and then didn't work as well on the oil because they were eating the dispersant chemicals instead. But yes, so in a normal situation, oil degrading bacteria are always present in places like the Gulf of Mexico because there are these naturally occurring oil seeps there. And in the event of an oil spill, they definitely multiply to take advantage of the extra oil and work to break it down. They're not going to be super fast, and the oil spill is going to still have a large environmental impact because they are tiny microscopic bacteria trying to degrade a large amount of oil, but they were present and they do help a tiny bit during an oil spill. So these are a different kind of tube worm that live near cold seeps. They are similar to the tube worms that live around hydrothermal vents, except for a few differences. They get equally as big, but they are skinny, like about as big around as my finger. They're the same idea where they don't really have a way in or out. They have bacteria that live inside their bodies that help them break down the chemicals that are coming out of these cold seeps. Because they live in cold water, they grow really, really slowly, and they can actually live for hundreds of years. Whereas the hydrothermal vent tube worms grow really fast and they die off pretty quickly as well. So here's another picture of these cold seep tube worms. They're a really interesting looking animal. They kind of look like bamboo a little bit. And then they actually have this root structure. So they are an animal, but they root down into the sediment, and the roots help pull chemicals out of the sea floor to feed the bacteria in their bodies as well. So they pull up like hydrogen sulfide and things from the sea floor and use that to feed their bacteria as well. So here's another picture of the cold seep tube worm. They're a really cool, interesting animal. These are actually little hydroids or anemones growing on the tube worm. And then just to share more with you guys, another resource. My office has developed a 4-part video series called The Adventures of Zach and Molly. And Molly is a Dumbo octopus and Zach is her human friend, and they go and explore deep sea ecosystems. 3 of the videos, they are in the Gulf of Mexico, and the 4th video, which we just released last Friday, they are in the Gulf of California with this beautiful hydrothermal vent. And they can tell you a little bit more about tube worms and chemosynthesis. So please visit our website, ECOGIG.org /Zach and Molly. You can watch all 4 videos there. There's also a learning guide with activities that you can do. I see a question. Do any ecosystems on land have bacteria that help as much as bacteria in oil seeps? So I'm thinking you're asking about ecosystems, land ecosystems, maybe having bacteria that would deal with a land oil spill, or just bacteria in general. That's a really good question that I'm not 100% sure on. I know that we have all sorts of interesting bacteria that live in like Yellowstone National Park around hot springs. There's a lot of like extreme environments on our planet that have lots of interesting microbial communities that live there. I'm assuming that there are some bacteria that live in like places where we drill for oil on land as well, but I don't know much about land bacteria. So that might be a good question for Google. Okay, and so then just to wrap things up, and something fun that those of you who have some time on your hands, one activity we really like to do with, I have a summer camp that I teach and also outreach booths that I do during the year. Normally, I like to have people do a little craft, so you can make your own tube worm or even a little garden of tube worms. Normally I have things like straws, scissors, pipe cleaners, but you can use a bunch of other things as well: construction paper, markers, glitter, leaves, sticks, stickers, anything you want to make your own tube worm, which, you know, if you need something to do, this is a fun little craft. So I'll show you. Here again are some inspirational pictures of tube worms. And then I will show you, I have had some summer campers in the past make their own tube worms. So this is a really fun little activity to do if you've got kids that need something to do, if you yourself want to do something, just kind of a fun afternoon craft. It's more therapeutic than you think. I have enjoyed creating my own tube worms. And then I also have more ocean activity ideas on our website as well. So ECOGIG.org/printables is a good place to find lots of activities, craft activities, and things you could do with your spare time. And then that is it for me today. A little shorter than I've been in the past. So I'm happy to answer questions. I do see one in the chat. So please feel free to ask some questions. Also, if you want to know anything more or more in depth, please feel free to email me, ecogigoutreach@gmail.com. And then let's see. Okay, so I've got a comment/question that says, I've always thought of the Gulf as being pretty boring, but then a giant squid was filmed a few years ago and whale sharks frequent the waters. How common are features like hydrothermal vents and cold seeps? So in the Gulf of Mexico, there are no hydrothermal vents, but there's lots of cold seeps, and we drill for oil all over the Gulf of Mexico. So they are very common there. They're anywhere along continental margins, you're going to probably find cold seeps and or hydrothermal vents. The Gulf of California has loads of hydrothermal vents there. Anywhere where the ocean ridges, there's an ocean ridge where there's spreading or plate tectonics happening, you're going to find hydrothermal vents. There's tons of cold seeps on the Atlantic coast. They're all over the oceans, so they're pretty common. I think it's actually the Gulf of Mexico is a little unique that it doesn't have hydrothermal vents. So that's just something to think about. But yeah, the deep sea may seem at first to be boring, but it's not at all. There's a lot of life to be found in the Gulf and all over our planet. And then another question, how fast do tubeworms grow? So it just depends on what kind of tubeworm. The hydrothermal vent tubeworms grow really fast, like they grow 6 to 8 feet in like 1 to 3 years. They're pretty fast growers. They live in the warm water surrounding the hydrothermal vents, so that kind of speeds up their growth. But then you have those cold seep tubeworms that live in the colder waters of just regular deep sea temperature waters, which is about the same temperature as your refrigerator. And they grow really slowly, and they can live for a very long time, like hundreds of years. And they just grow a teeny tiny bit every year, whereas the deep sea tubeworms grow really fast. So it just depends on the species. Any other questions, guys? If not, thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And we have another webinar happening next week for those interested in deep sea adaptations. So how do animals live and thrive in the deep sea? Please come back next Wednesday at 1 o'clock and I'll be talking to you about that. And all of these also live on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ECOGIG EPO, no, ECOGIG.ORG EPO. That's our YouTube channel. Tune in there if you've missed any of these. They're all different and you can rewatch them at your leisure. But thank you everyone for participating, and hopefully I'll see you next Wednesday. Thanks, guys.